Hey everyone, we are about to start part 3 of our 4-part series, Into the Unknown. But before we do, I want to introduce our special guest. He is someone that I have admired for a long time because he is my dad. This is Mike Oliver. He is a college professor. He is a great husband, a great father, and many, many things. But Dad, so glad that you're helping me today and preach this message.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah.
And it's great to have you and our grandchildren here visiting.
Yes, that's right. It is. It's so good to be together for Thanksgiving, and we've just really enjoyed our relationship. And in fact, one of the reasons that I wanted to bring my dad on today to help me preach this message is because today we're going to be looking at a couple stories about a relationship between a father and a son. Two very difficult stories, actually, and I can't think of anyone that I would rather do this message with more than my own dad. And so looking forward to that. So for those of you who are joining us maybe for the first time in this series, this is part 3 of a 4-part series, Into the Unknown, which I know it sounds a little bit dramatic, into the unknown. It's just, but the subtitle really says it all. It's 4 decisions for experiencing and influencing deep change. And over the last couple of weeks, we've talked about the word change and the tension that comes with that word. In fact, when you hear that word, or you hear somebody talking about change, you think, okay, they're wanting me to change. What exactly do you mean by change? But change is really essential. And if you're a follower of Jesus, you know that change is absolutely essential because the direction you were headed in had a destination you didn't want to end up in. And so you started following Jesus and have begun to experience some of the benefits of following him, experience really the benefits of eternal life that Jesus is bringing to this earth and his kingdom coming to this earth. And yet so often, and you know this better than anybody, with me personally, I have experienced how we're supposed to influence change in the world, and yet we get stuck. We sometimes get stuck in our own routines, our own just habits, and we don't move forward. We don't continue the journey. And there's a couple reasons for that. And so I just want to review real quickly before we get going. A couple of the reasons that we've talked about why change is so challenging is it requires so much mental and emotional energy to change. And so at the end of the day, sometimes we're just too tired. You're just too tired to change. And that's why you need a father and a mother, and you need people in your life who will challenge you in those times and challenge you to continue growing. And so you have been that for me in my life and continue to be that for me in my life. But change is so challenging because we're often just too tired. And sometimes, and I've experienced this, and you may have felt this as well, sometimes we're just a little bit too content with the progress that we've already made. You kind of look back over your life, you look back over a season, and you see a period of growth, and you've experienced that growth, and you kind of just feel this sense of pride about it. Like, look how far I've come, and, look how much better I am now than I was then. And so we don't keep moving forward because we grow complacent. We're just a little bit too content with the progress that we've already made. And there's a number of other reasons why change is so challenging, and you interject at any point that you want to. But one that I have found and witnessed in my own life and witnessed in other lives is that sometimes change is just too risky. You look at what you have, and you look at what your life is, and you've grown comfortable with it, and maybe it's good, and there's a lot of good parts about your life, and you look at the unknown. You look at the next step of the journey, and there's so much uncertainty there, and there's so much questions about what would that be like, and so you're weighing this balance of something that you know for something that you don't, and it just doesn't seem like it might be a good enough risk to take.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Change always involves some failures, micro failures, big failures, and it takes a while to be able to embrace this concept that failure can be a good thing, a learning thing, a necessary thing, and so. But it's also can be an embarrassing thing and an uncomfortable thing for sure. So it's easy, I know in my own life, to want to stay doing what I've always done. We just moved, recently, and on the one hand, I found myself caught in this, catch-22. I really wanted to move on the one hand, but I didn't want to go through the change that was going to be necessary to pack everything up and to fix the new place up and to go through that process. And it kind of helped to slow us down a little bit, drag our feet a little bit, but you just keep going back to, but the end result, where I'm going to go, is going to be so much better and worth the journey in between. And so when you can step out, we're always glad, in more times than not, when we're doing a change that's good for us. We're always thankful and grateful once we get there and glad we did it. But boy, the effort to get there can just be overwhelming at times.
Yeah, that's such a good point, and it really goes right to the story of what we've been in the last couple of weeks, the story of Abraham in Genesis 12 through 25. If you haven't started reading that, I would really encourage you to do that, because there's some fascinating and weird stories in the story of Abraham. And it started with God calling him to leave his land, his birthplace, his family, his friends, his father's house, and go into the unknown, to a land that he would show him. And we see that in God calling him to do those things, to leave those things behind, that what we hold often holds us back. And sometimes this can be really good things like family and friends. And, some of you may be thinking of friends that are just holding you back right now, but that's not necessarily what I mean. I mean just that comfort of them being there, and yet God calls us deeper and deeper and deeper. And sometimes what we hold often holds us back, and what we hold is a sin. And a sin that's like really, very figuratively, you are holding it, and it has a hold on you, and literally is keeping you from moving forward. And so that's kind of the tension that you play with what you hold often holds us back. So for the last couple of weeks, as we're reviewing this, we talked about the importance of remaining open-handed, and that was the first decision of the 4 of experiencing and influencing deep change in your life. And influencing that change in others' life is that what we hold often holds us back. We choose to remain open-handed with God. When following God, the best is always yet to come. Our job is to remain open-handed. And as we move forward, we see in the story of Abraham that for influencing change in the world, required taking responsibility. The history of humanity up until his story was a failure of responsibility. God had given Adam and Eve this, instruction to not eat of this one tree in the garden. They, of course, do. Adam blames Eve. Eve blames the serpent. They deny personal responsibility. Their son, the resentment for his brother grows to the point that he ends up murdering him. God comes to call, and he denies relational responsibility, saying, I don't know where he is, and am I my brother's keeper anyway? He denies relational responsibility. But we see Abraham rising above personal and relational responsibility to take responsibility for a community, the Sodom and Gomorrah, a community that was well known for its sin. And we see that Abraham chose to take responsibility, and God had chosen him specifically to be a father, to be a good parent. But in those stories of Abraham taking responsibility, God is signaling the importance not just of biological parenthood, but of spiritual parenthood, and how he's calling his leaders to take responsibility for a world that needs good parents, and it needs people who can guide them back in the way that they should go. And so this concept of parenthood, of fatherhood, it's so, so important. And that's, again, why I wanted my dad here today to talk about that as we transition now into this point in Abraham's story. We're right where we begin to see how God has called him to be a father, to be a role model father for generations to come, the father, the patriarch of the family that Jesus Christ was born into. We see that. And then God calls him to do 2, I'm going to call them anti-fatherly tasks. 2 anti-fatherly tasks. One is the sending away of his son Ishmael. And you think about being a good father and being a role model father, and here God has called him to be a father, and he's telling him to send away his son Ishmael, and the strangeness of that, followed by something even stranger, the sacrificing, God calling him to sacrifice his son Isaac. And so there's a lot of tension in there. In fact, if you are not a Christian and someone has told you to read your Bible and you started at the beginning and you're reading through and you've read a lot of strange stories, when you get to here, this can cause a lot of tension. These two stories can cause a lot of tension for you in your understanding of God. And I'll tell you, it's not just you. It's Christians who struggle with these two stories. In fact, they're two of the most perplexing stories in really our whole Bibles. And so understanding them is critical for us to understand God and his essence. And it's important for us to understand ourselves as well.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, because we forget, not just for somebody out there that may be visiting for the first time as an adult, but even our children, especially, for our children, they do not have the cognitive ability to process the context of which we speak from. And it's probably one of my own personal frustrations for myself is when you've been thinking about something for a long time and you've been reading about it, right? And then I will, interrupt, if you will, my wife or one of my kids to share this with them. And I'm speaking out of a context in my mind that their context is nowhere near that. They don't have it, right? They're like some other place. And so it seems like out of the blue, and you throw something and they don't respond like you want them to, and you're going, why don't you get this? Mm-hmm. And it eventually dawns on you, it's like, because they haven't been tracking all of this with you to understand the importance of the point you're trying to make to them. It just seems so out of the blue, random, crazy. I don't understand. I don't even want to do it.
Yeah.
So I can only imagine somebody first coming in and, opening their Bible at random and coming to this story and go, I don't think I want to serve that God.
Right. Yeah. No, exactly. The context is so important. And here we see God is signaling really some tension that exists between fathers and sons, between one generation and the next, and that's an early sign of really what God's trying to teach us here. And so we're going to jump into these two stories of the sending away of Abraham's son Ishmael and God's calling of Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. And there's something to be learned, I think, from both of these stories simultaneously. So let's jump in there and do that now. And because context is so important, for those of you who don't have the context or is a little bit foggy on this story of Abraham and his son Ishmael, God had promised Abraham to go to a new land, that he was going to make him into a great nation, that he was going to bless all other nations of the earth. And Abraham is already an old man. He and his wife Sarah have been barren. They've been infertile. They've not been able to have children. And they're already very old. And they start to kind of scheme on how maybe God really wanted to bless them with children. And so Sarah comes to Abraham and says, since we've not been able to have kids, why don't you take my handmaid, why don't you take my servant Hagar, and why don't y'all sleep together and y'all have a baby? Perhaps this covenant that God is making with you will pass to that child. And if that wasn't a red flag, right there, I don't know what was, but Abraham went along with it, and Hagar becomes pregnant, and they end up giving birth to a son named Ishmael. And that's really where the problem starts for them. God later comes to Abraham and he says that Ishmael is not going to fall under God's blessing to bless all other peoples, the promise that God had made to him in the beginning. It's not going to come to Ishmael. And we see Abraham, and we often just kind of, if you're reading through this, at least I have done this before, you just kind of read through it, and you don't think about the consequences really that come with Abraham's decision to go through with that. But what we often miss, I think, is that Abraham loved Ishmael. He was his son. And God is sending him away. And Abraham actually pleads with God and says, could your blessing not fall on Ishmael? And it's important for us to remember, Hagar, she was a slave. She was a slave of Abraham and Sarah. And so the son that was born to Hagar, Ishmael, he was born into slavery. and he wasn't a free son. And so God tells him to send Ishmael away, really to reemphasize that the consequences of disobedience are relationally destructive. Abraham was to be this role model for many generations to come. Adam and Eve had already suffered some of those consequences of disobeying God and becoming relationally separate from him. But now Abraham has chosen to be this role model for generations to come, and it's a reminder for his children and their children after him, all the way down the line to us, that disobedience, the consequences of disobedience are relationally destructive. God will turn your mistakes into something good, and he tells Abraham that he's going to bless Ishmael, and really believe that God is still trying to bless Ishmael today. But you said something to me growing up and to my siblings pretty often whenever there were times of, we didn't really know what to do, or we were trying to act outside of a certain maybe even ethical behavior. You would always say, hey, don't create an Ishmael. And that has stuck with me. You said it to me so many times. Hey, don't create an Ishmael. Wait on God. And so really, where did that come from for you? How did that resonate with you, and why that, as a father telling your children? I don't know. How did that come about?
Well, yeah, I wish I could remember what the context was exactly that understanding hit me. But I had observed enough people from teaching in a Christian university, getting to see a lot of young people. They have hopes and dreams of, they want to serve God, and they want to, be this servant of God. And yet there were times that all of us have done this, where we've prayed for God to do something in our life. And then instead of waiting, we help God out. And that's kind of the lesson of don't create any more Ishmaels. We're still paying for the last time that somebody tried to help God out in a big way today. And so you think about the story of Ishmael and how Hagar was told he even his name was going to represent that he was against everybody. And boy, that's played out in our nations and played havoc with us in many, many ways, all the way these many thousands of years later. And it's like, wow, what would have happened if Abraham and Sarah had just, been patient and waited for this to play out? Would we even have what we have today? But, I would think not, but, I can't be sure. But anyway, the story is really makes the point well. And so one of the things, that this popped up in a conversation was with your older sister. And, she wanted, like we want everybody in our family to find a good, spouse, to raise a family, and do all those things that are wonderful. She too, was wanting to, but here she had graduated from college, and then she, was not in a relationship at this point, and she's continuing, and I'll brag on her. Everybody loves her, and they, we had so many people, they start asking, well, is there nobody in there? What about my grandson? What about, people start coming up with these ideas, and it gets overwhelming for the person that's out there listening to this. If you're in this situation, you feel like you're less than maybe what your loved ones kind of communicate to you, but that's not the truth at all. It's really this great desire to answer a prayer that you may have, or a desire you have in this life. So don't misread that if you're in this boat. But it's easy to get lost in it, right? Because people are just, it just kind of naturally comes up. And so anyway, so she had some family, some friends, and everything. We're in Searcy, Arkansas, small town, middle of the state, and you're looking at just the population itself, right? It's pretty small. And so you got people from Dallas going, you should move to Dallas, with the implication that there's more people for God to choose from here in Dallas, or you should move to Nashville. And she started kicking around this idea of moving, And we sat down and had this conversation, and I said, listen, you've heard me say this before, you know, you don't want to create any Ishmaels here. If you want to move to Dallas because you want to move to Dallas and no other reason, or to Nashville or wherever that is, then you have my blessing, you know, move. But if you are remotely thinking this will make it easier for God to come up with that young man that we're all praying for, then you are making a huge mistake, and you would not have my blessing under those circumstances. That sounds harsh, but you know what I'm saying when I said that. And I'm like, he does not need your help to answer this prayer. He does not need your help ever. And so what you are being called to do, it's possible, and we had this conversation, you know, it's very possible that God's plan for you is to remain single because he's got other things that he needs you to do, and a family is just not a part of it if you want to be on his mission, right? And so I hope that's not it, but we have to be willing to accept that. That is a possibility, all right? We'll see what happens. But he works in his time, not our time, if we're trusting in him. And Sarah and Abraham were not patient enough to wait in God's time. And so they took matters in their own hands. And that lesson is really important for, I think, all of us who are believing in God and praying to God to guide us and direct us. And we use that language a lot, but then we kind of undermine it by jumping out there and taking matters into our own hands. And so, you know, we were able to say, listen, if he doesn't know where Searcy, Arkansas is, then he doesn't know where Dallas, Texas is either. I mean, he knows where this is. And he knows the many prayers that have gone up requesting this on your behalf. He knows this. So let's trust him, you know, and let's just be patient. And in the meantime, in your singleness, you have a great opportunity to throw yourself into things that you can only do as a single person could do. And she did. She got very involved in our church and took responsibility for our preschool age kids, and started being a coordinator for that, and just got really, you know, involved in serving in a way that she couldn't have done very easily as a married person. And lo and behold, God's plan was revealed in just a few years after that. And she has an incredible, wonderful husband, and we couldn't be more pleased with how those things have played out.
Yeah, that's so good. And it's such a good illustration. And some of you may be thinking, I've already created some Ishmaels in my life. I know I've created some as well. But it's so important to remember that the consequences of disobedience are relationally destructive. So don't create an Ishmael. Choose to wait on God instead.
And let me interject this.
Yeah.
You saw that almost immediately with Abraham and Sarah, because you had some appearance of harmony with Hagar. Hagar was not chosen, I would assume, because there was a bad relationship with Sarah and Hagar, but quite the opposite. And yet this relationship that was intact immediately began to break down between Sarah and Abraham, and then Sarah and Hagar. And, you know, and so right there in that little small circle, we saw a relational breakdown as a result of this act of, with good intention, right? I mean, good intention, but boy, God does not need my help or your help to fulfill his mission.
Yeah, that's great. And poor Ishmael got caught up in the middle of that triangle.
He
did. Again, the consequences of disobedience are relationally destructive. And that's important to hang on to as we move into this next really complicated story. In fact, we don't have time to fully go through the depths of this next story because it's just so deep. This is the story of God saying to Abraham to go and sacrifice his son Isaac, the one whom he has already told him will be the one his covenant will pass to. And so Abraham, choosing to obey God, takes his son, and they go out into the wilderness. He tells his servants to wait there, you know, and he says, we're going to go over there and we're going to worship God. We're going to come back. He's trusting God fully that God is going to come through in this big moment. In fact, Isaac even asks him, you know, Dad, where's the sacrifice that we're going to make? And we see Abraham's confidence here. God's going to provide, buddy. We're going to keep going. And so Abraham is going to sacrifice his son. He's going to go through with it. And it's not initially clear why God asked him to do that. And so I wanted to talk about a couple of the reasons that God did not want him to sacrifice his son, and we see that play out. And so I want to address these because it wasn't until I was a little bit older in my life, even though growing up in church and hearing this story, and for those of you who remember flannel graphs, you kind of see that on flannel graphs growing up, and it's taught to you, but it's not until I was older that I fully understood what God was trying to teach. In fact, one of the lessons that I took away from that I don't think is the case was that, you're kind of living your life and waiting for God to come and tell you to do something that you really don't want to do, something big and something that's really outside of his moral, ethical code. And so this first one I want to address is that, there were a lot of other religions who were sacrificing, people who were part of those religions, they were sacrificing their children to God. And we know that God is a jealous God, but God did not ask Abraham to sacrifice his son because he was jealous about how everyone else was treating their God and they're showing their devotion to their God. In fact, child sacrifice was such a pagan practice, and we see that later, in 2 Kings 3. A king of Moab ends up sacrificing his son, and ends up being this whole big mess. A couple of Israel's leaders in the book of Judges had sacrificed. One, Jephthah, had sacrificed his daughter. King Ahaz, one of the most wicked kings of Israel, had sacrificed a couple of his sons. I mean, God was against child sacrifice. In fact, really, this was God bringing Abraham up to this cliff, this moment of saying, hey, while all the other religions may be doing this, I do not ask you to do this. And this is such an emotional moment for Abraham and for Isaac. I'm bringing you all the way up to say, never sacrifice your children. In fact, God commands against the practice later in the Torah, in this law that he gives Moses and the Israelites. Do not sacrifice your children to Molech or to any other god, because I am the God of the living, not the God of the dead. So I think that is really, really super important to understand, because God is good, and this, without that context, might be in question.
Yeah.
The second is that God did not ask Abraham to sacrifice his son because he didn't already know how Abraham would respond. When Abraham starts to go through with this, and he picks up this knife and he's about to slay his son, this angel stops him and communicates a message from God that says, now I know that you would not withhold your son from me. But God is an all-knowing God, an all-powerful God who knows everything before it happens. And so it's not so much about God knowing, but it's about Abraham knowing and Isaac knowing, and them experiencing this together, and experiencing really kind of the importance of parenthood and of waiting. And I believe that Abraham learned through this waiting for Isaac and risking losing Isaac in this moment, how much more then he should treasure his son. It's really kind of a lesson in parenting that, unlike the paradigm of the day, you do not own your children. They are not property. You should treat them as God's children, because they are ultimately and first and foremost, they are God's children, not yours. Abraham, care for my children. Really important. So, those are a couple reasons that God did not ask Abraham to sacrifice his children. God is the God of the living, not the dead, and children are first and foremost God's children, not our own. But we've talked about this story many times before, and you have talked about how it ties into what later becomes known as the two greatest commands, to love God with all your heart and to love your neighbor as yourself. And so why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and let me just tag on to the last thing you had said about, who this was for. God called Abraham to be the father of many, right? And so I think what we see in Abraham's life with this call to sacrifice Isaac was not just for Abraham and not just for Isaac, but it was for all of us who would follow one day and look to Abraham as a father you know, and a father of faith, a man of great faith. And so we extract from that, you know, lessons even today that go well beyond that one incident for Abraham and Isaac. You know, they went home, you know, I would love to know what the conversation was, you know, at the table. We've heard, you know, a comedian talk about how it changed father-son camping for that household forever. You know, the next time Abraham said, "Hey, Isaac, let's go camping," he was like, "No, why don't you take Ishmael?
Right.
I'll be good.
Right.
I'll be good. I don't want to take a chance this time," right? So there's some interesting side pieces to that. But yeah, so if I were to ask anybody out there, and I've done this, you know, several times with my students, and but if I were to ask any of you out there, you know, could you tell me what the greatest commandment is? I would bet just about every one of you that grew up in the church could raise your hand, and you could tell me to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. And I could do that. I could do that for years. And then what's the second greatest commandment? Love your neighbor as yourself, you know. And it hit me one day, just thinking about this, that when I was prompted, you know, to answer that question, I always could. And in the back of my mind, I had this little bit of like good feeling inside, like, you know, like I'll be ready for that on Judgment Day. When he asks that question,
Right.
I'll get that one right, you know, points for me, right? But then I don't know, again, what, you know, got me thinking about this, but it was like, how has those two commandments really changed or informed my everyday thinking and my actions? You know, how has it made a difference? In other words, how different it should be, but how different was it really than if you'd asked me, you know, what's the capital of Arkansas? I'm like, oh, Little Rock. Okay, well, that's a idea that has had no bearing on the fulfillment of my life in any capacity whatsoever, right? It's just a trivia question. And so I started asking myself, have I trivialized the two greatest commandments, you know, to a Q&A, you know, in a, you know, like a quiz bowl kind of thing. And when it gets asked, I'm like, I know that, you know, and then I feel good about it. But beyond that, you know, that should be measuring my life. In fact, if you continue to read past those two verses, you know, it says, all the law and prophets hinge on these two commands. You know, everything else that we read hinges on these two commandments. And if they don't hinge on those two commandments, good chance you and I misunderstand what those are about, okay? And so then, you know, you're sitting there going, well, what, you know what this is? You know, you hit this aha moment and you go, this is relationship. The two greatest commandments are centered in relationship. In fact, it was kind of, for me at least, maybe it will kind of hit you somewhat this way, but I was like, wow, you know, I could never memorize the entire Bible. I don't believe I could. You know, maybe somebody out there could coach me into it, but I'm like, I don't think that's just monumental. But the entire message can be found in these two greatest commandments, you know, and that is relationship. And you look at them, they're shrink them down: relationship with God, relationship with others. It's all about relationship. And that is and should be the most important thing in terms of how we live our life, is what does this do for the relationship with God? What's this do for the relationship with others? And your neighbor is certainly inclusive of your family members and, you know, everyone around you. And so, you know, so I started just chewing that around, thinking about that, and then it also hit me when we got into some of these cultural challenges in our church of wanting to reach out for the sake of our neighbor, you know, to love our neighbor. You know, we should, as a church or individual, do some things that at first glance you're like, but that doesn't seem like it is. It would be loving our neighbor, but it seems like it would go against what God asks us to do. And so then it kind of went back and said, well, wait a minute, you know, there is an order to these commandments, and it's God first and neighbor second. And even though they're so intertwined, they're so close, the order still must maintain in that 1-2 order, because what you get with that 1-2 order is you get context for what it means to love your neighbor. So remove the first commandment altogether and just have the second one, and that's it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Sounds wonderful, right? But that will take you to places outside of where God would want us to go and what God would desire of us. And so you have to put that back in and you say, I need to love my neighbor as myself within the context of loving God with all my heart, soul, strength, and mind. And so, interesting enough, we see this opportunity, this possibility in our own lives where these two commandments come in conflict with one another. And so I immediately went back to Abraham and Isaac, right? And so there you have God, who he's wanting to love with all his heart, soul, strength, and mind, being called to sacrifice his neighbor, right? And the two are in conflict with one another. How do I love my neighbor, my son in this case, as myself, and maintain the greatest commandment of loving God? And he put us in, put Abraham in a real serious dilemma there of having to choose. And Abraham, as we know now, chose, to put God first, even though it looked like it was going to totally go against.
That's really just such a good point, because here it's not that Abraham's love is in question. I mean, Abraham has already left his father's house, and he's already gone out on this journey on his own, following God. He's already shown, too, that he is a man who loves and takes responsibility for others as well. So it's not so much a question about Abraham's love, but really prioritizing commandment number 1, to love God, and commandment number 2, to love our neighbor as ourselves. And so that's why I love these two stories, even though they're so hard to understand, because in one, we have the consequences with Ishmael. The consequences of disobedience are relationally destructive. Faced with the consequences of obedience and obeying God. And sometimes the consequences of obeying God are really intimidating, to say the least. These are two heart-wrenching stories, and Abraham really showed us that you never be wholly content, you never be wholly at peace, withholding a part of your heart from God. God wants your whole heart, and he wants it prioritized to love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your might, and love your neighbor as yourself. So it's about those consequences, and that really brings us to our bottom line here, which is to obey God and leave the outcome up to him. Obey God and leave the outcome up to him. The consequences of going outside of God's promise are relationally destructive. The consequences of obeying God are intimidating, and we're faced with those that dilemma in our own life. Some of you, you may be in the workplace faced with an ethical dilemma of, you're being asked to do something that you don't feel fully comfortable with, or doesn't fully align with God's will and God's law, and yet you are tempted to go outside that and follow, this other trail and kind of skirt that a little bit, and yet obeying God and leaving the outcome up to him is so much better. And we see that in our own relationships as well. Maybe with, your husband with your wife, or wife with your husband. You're tempted at times where maybe your needs aren't being met, and you're tempted to go outside of that covenant, that promise that you've made. And yet, obey God and leave the outcome up to him. It's so much more important. So this leads us to decision number 3 in our series of 4 decisions for experiencing and influencing deep change. Decision number 3 is choosing to submit. Choosing to submit. Choosing to obey God and leave the outcome up to him. Now, one thing that comes up, I think, pretty often in this story, and there's some confusion about God being willing, God asking Abraham to sacrifice his son, is, but didn't God sacrifice his son? And Jesus addresses this head on in John chapter 10, where he says, "No one takes my life from me. I sacrifice it voluntarily. I give it up on my own, and I have the authority to take it up again." He chose, "Lord, not my will, but your will be done. Not my will, but yours to be done." Submitting to God, and he experienced the resurrection in his own life that is really available to us as well, which is so amazing. Obey God and leave the outcome up to him. So over the last couple weeks, we've ended with kind of a self-reflecting question and a prayer and a way to practice this in our own lives. And so this is the question that I would love for you to ask yourself. In what area of my life do I need to start submitting? In what area of my life maybe have I not been submitting? Have I been willing, to go outside of God's law? Have I been intimidated by the consequences of obeying God? Where in my life do I need to start submitting? And then number 2, a prayer. Lord, give me the courage to submit even when the consequences seem great. Lord, give me the courage to submit even when the consequences seem great. And we get to practice this in our own lives, in our own relationships, you husbands with your wives, wives with your husbands, where God says to choose to submit to one another. Out of reverence for me, choose to submit to one another. And we get to practice submitting to one another in these relationships. And I would encourage you to do that as well. Obey God and leave the outcome up to him. Obey God and leave the outcome up to him. Well, that concludes part 3 of our 4-part series. 4 decisions for experiencing and influencing deep change. Come back next week for part 4 and we'll wrap it up there.